right, we are live now with our fourth installment of Loadbang Power Chats with Mark Applebaum, who's playing himself in this time because none of us have the skills to play him in. So he's doing double duty tonight. So we're really thrilled to have Mark Applebaum here. We're going to talk about his piece, Administocracy, he wrote for us a handful of years ago, and then see where that takes us. So now Mark has to fade himself in.
Hey.
And we're good. Mark, thank you so much for being here, for hanging out with us tonight. This has been a really fun series for us to be doing and keeping ourselves active when we're not allowed to be in the same room playing concerts together. And we're not able to be rehearsing your piece.
The fun ends now, though. It's time for now a soul-sucking... this is...
It's going to be a slog.
It's going to be a slog with me.
That's why we keep them 30 minutes. We had you in mind when we decided just 30 minutes.
This 30 minutes will feel like 30 hours.
So I was thinking, when you wrote us that piece, we got it. And the first thing that we see, obviously, are the pages of notes about different ways to approach it. And sometimes that sucks to get. But in the case with you, it not only was it super informative, but it was also really fun and fascinating to read and was incredibly helpful. And one of the things right off the bat that you talked about that was really interesting for us was this idea that you had paraphrased from Henry Louis Gates. And he was talking about literature, I think, where you read this, but it seemed like it worked really nicely with your work. And you paraphrased it as, historically speaking, the be-all and end-all of European creative genius privileges formal invention, whereas African-American aesthetic values particularize signifying over a formulaic archetype, for instance, like the 12-bar blues, in order to express individuality while also maintaining continuity of community. And then you explored what that actually meant in terms of your relationship to music and writing this piece for us. I would just love to pick your brain a little bit more about where you came across that and how that influenced this piece, but also has it sort of worked its way into some other of your recent work?
Sure. Well, first let me contextualize that a little bit and say that apologies for any kind of crude or reckless reductionism that is somehow assigned to race. This is in no way, in my mind, or I believe in Henry Louis Gates' mind, to say that African Americans are one kind of thing or are in any way should be limited to one sort of thing. So these are reckless, very maybe facile reductions in a sense, or essentializations, and that may be unfair. So I want to first acknowledge that. That said, there is this kind of, I came across that idea actually in a book by musicologist Susan McClary. It's not Feminine Endings, it's the next one after that. And anyway, that was the place where I first found it for myself. But the idea of signifying and the signifying monkey and so forth has this longer historic tradition. And for me, I guess, let me place it in the context of my own work, which is to say that I came up through a kind of modernist tradition where it was about formal invention. So I really identified with this idea that you have these weird idiosyncratic forms and pieces are their own autonomous universe, and they are in discourse with a tradition in a sense, but formally you're always inventing something new, and the piece itself is a kind of a universe that expresses its own set of values and its own rules, and how aesthetics in a sense operate within the discourse framed by that one piece. And that's cool, and a lot of pieces that I've made have operated that way. Whereas there is this idea of forms that are familiar, and then the idea is what the individual practitioner does with it. So the jazz soloist who's playing saxophone blowing over some rhythm changes or over 12 bar blues or whatnot. So you have this idea, and no one's expecting that you like, oh, that saxophonist was not inventive or original because he or she did not personally invent the 12 bar blues. That's not a standard that in a lot of vernacular genres, a lot of genres that African Americans invented and were pioneers of. That's not a standard that we expect or care about. It seems like ridiculous. You don't in hip hop, somebody's rapping, you would never say like, okay, that person's using 4/4. He didn't invent that meter, so this is not really a creative act. You know, we wouldn't say that. Instead, we're interested in there's this beat. It's more or less familiar. It maybe is one of a kind. Maybe it's not even, but it's like very familiar to us. But like, what are the rhymes and what are the words and what is the story that is being told? What are the vocalizations like and so forth? And that is a very personal act of invention, act of creativity, right? And so the locus of expression or of originality, if we could say that, resides there. So there's so much music, like blues, like I was playing to start the session, and jazz that I admire that is about this idea of signifying, where you inherit an extant form, but then you do something original with it, you do something personal with it, and you do something with probably vocabulary that is more familiar than say unfamiliar. So it's not like alien in that regard. And and then I also have this tradition of writing these weird, you know, what I call my uncompromising and unmarketable experimental music. And I was just always, and I'm thinking of like in jazz, for example, there's these old Jamie Aebersold records that I grew up on, and even before me, this music minus one thing, where somebody's playing a tune but without like a lead instrument, and then you can jam over it, and so you can like play with this preset rhythm section, and then you can, you know, jam over it. And I was thinking, what would a music minus one in a kind of new music context be? And so Administocracy, the piece for you guys, was this weird fusion, this hybrid of these things, where you have a very idiosyncratic form, this weird, screwed up contemporary music thing with a lot of specification for three or four of you, and then one of you gets to blow over the top of it. And what does blowing mean in the context of a piece that isn't an extant form that you've inherited? You know, what I gave you as a framework was not 12 bar blues. It was far more weird and idiosyncratic and strange, and it had lots of mannerist kinds of aesthetic qualities and lots of elements that are not very predictable. Okay, I'm sorry, I've been rather loquacious at this, but I don't
Well,
know if that was
I just wanted to jump in actually on the note where you were talking about like it's the kind of aesthetic judgments or the kind of frames that we put around our thoughts on certain kinds of music seem ludicrous when you put them around something else. Like, he's rhythmically speaking over music in a way that rhymes, and he's using his voice in a creative way, but he didn't invent that. So I don't know, like it's a very funny thing. So I wanted to ask you about specifically your use of humor in music and your use of things that I think there's an incongruity a lot of the times in the humor in your pieces that works really beautifully. And I just wanted to ask how you navigate humor in music, because I feel like it's very delicate, and it very often, the humor in music generally very often can fail and make a very unpleasant experience for all involved.
That's right. Well, thanks, Jeffrey. I think that first of all, humor is part of life, and so, or at least it is for me, and I think for most people. And so, I don't, like many of my colleagues, I don't forbid it, unlike many of my colleagues, I should say, I don't forbid it from entering my music. I think there's a lot of composers who have this idea that the um, gravity and seriousness are somehow compromised if they are joined with playfulness and levity and
Right. I
humor.
was just playing a really funny Haydn sonata today. It's like there's really, really funny stuff,
Right.
in a lot of the history of classical music.
Absolutely. So it's there, it's in our DNA, but somehow in the 20th century we got really hard-assed, a lot of us, and then we said like, oh no, I'm to show that I'm a serious composer, I have to purge music from it. But you're right, but it's you can't it comes with at some peril potentially. And so I think there's a first of all, humor is not one thing. So I'm not interested in really what I'd call the comedic in music. So but I'm interested in humor. I'm interested in like wittiness, of course, and I think some of Haydn's stuff is witty. I'm interested in whimsy, but I'm interested and playfulness, but I'm interested in playfulness that is combined with a seriousness of purpose. Like if you play, um, there are games that we play that have elaborate rules systems, like really complicated games, but we play them. Here's the thing: a lot of when you talk to kids who are musicians, they say, I play the flute, I play the violin, I play the piano. And then later on, as they get more adult and they take on more of an adult relationship to their craft, it's no longer playful. They perform on the flute, they perform on the violin, they perform on the piano. And there's a lot of the construction of their ego is based on notions of success or avoidances of failures and so forth. And I think that some of that sucks some of the joy out of what professional musicians do. And so if I'm on a tear of sorts, in some ways it's to return or acknowledge that playfulness is something that is really absolutely wonderful and is valuable. And so some of the things I kind of avoid silliness often in, but you use the word I think incongruity, so or surrealism, and so like I mean I love to live there. So the incongruous juxtaposition of subject matter is intrinsically interesting to me. Sometimes it's a bit funny, sometimes it's not. But I'm really interested in weird. I'm interested in odd things, in weird formulations, in idiosyncratic combinations of things, in unexpected collisions. These things really fascinate me, and so that's a source of what I see as being the humor in some of my pieces. And I know I've been lengthy, but I'm going to say one last thing, which is for me, much of this stuff works when the players do not try to express the humor. You simply do these odd things and you do them in prosaic, quotidian ways, and they are funny that way. If you try to ham them up, if you try to play for the joke, that is the thing you're talking about. That is super dangerous. Yeah, no one wants to see that. That's really tedious. So doing things in a sort of deadpan way, having sometimes a superfluity of weirdness, so much so that the players can feel comfortable knowing that the audience may miss a certain percentage of them, and then you feel confident knowing you don't have to broadcast the joke or something. You just do the thing, and it can be funny.
Mark, since we're on the topic of humor and how we present any given product that we have in our hands, you use a lot of movement in the piece that you wrote for us. I wanted to see if you could talk to us a bit more about the evolution of those movements and how you came to the notation that you use for those movements.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I think I find it useful to acknowledge that movement is intrinsic in pretty much all music. Even we could possibly even say that in tape music, there is a metaphor of the corporeal expressed in some way. But for the most part, I mean, if we talk about live musicians, there's movement there, and we're interested in the human body in space, and it fascinates us. And I think we should be aware of it, and we should use it. Of course, if a flutist made the kind of gestures that are intrinsic to percussion playing, that might be considered garish and grotesque and some weird perversion or inauthentic. So some of these things, are little movements in one instrument, and they tend to be more intrinsically theatrical, I suppose, or we've perceive them that way with others. But first of all, the body in space and movement is intrinsic in almost all music. And so I've just been kind of deliberate in increasingly choreographing some of these things. When I compose a piece of music, it's absolutely essential for me to know the layout of the players in space. Even in a conventional thing, if I'm writing a string quartet, and about half of my string quartets are conventional and don't have specific theater and choreography, and the other half have very deliberate theater and choreography, I need to know, is this the one where the cello is over here or the cello is back here? You know, that's really important to me. So I really have a sense of the space and how the bodies look on stage. And then, but then sometimes there are specifications for how I want to see people moving around. This has evolved over time. I wrote this piece for this great Belgian ensemble, Chambre d'Action, who are in Antwerp, called The Blue Cloak. And it was a sextet or a septet that had mirror images, full setups on both sides of the stage. So they could all be playing here, or they could all be playing here, conductor in the middle, or the pianist at this grand piano, but not at this grand piano, the percussionist over here, the bass clarinetist on this side, and then moving at various times from place to changing place and so forth. So that was like a very conventional setup, except it was doubled, and it had very specific times that I wanted to hear these weird antiphonal kinds of things. And then there's other pieces that are even more elaborate. The piece that I've just finished for Ensemble Talia that I've been working on for almost 2 years is an hour-long piece. It's a full evening project. It's called Venture Capital Punishment. And the players, it's a septet, and the players are engaged. It's an hour-long continuous piece in 9 movements, but the inner 7 movements, each one of those, one of the instrumentalists is missing and has to go to a table, either the table on this side of the stage or on this side of the stage, and perform all these very specifically choreographed actions with these household objects and strange things that you'd find. And it becomes like this almost Cage Cunningham-like cohabitation rather than coordination of simultaneous media. And the pieces, maybe even problematically, it's expressively saturated in the aural dimension. You can close your eyes and listen to the piece. You don't have to watch the people at the table, and it's a full experience. Or you can get distracted and, as a consequence, underhear the music because you are really interested in tracking what's going on with these strange table gestures. So that's also a hybrid. And then there are pieces that I've made which are almost exclusively, which are actually silent and are choreographed. My piece Flynn for 3 conductors and no players, essentially makes no sound, but it's all about the idea of conduction as a visual medium, maybe first and foremost. Don't tell a conductor I said that. Obviously, they think it has a very different purpose, and the reason, the motivation for conducting is to bring forth sound. But anyway, as a radical non-conductor, that's my inspiration. I'm sorry, I think I may have answered a question you didn't ask.
Oh, it actually really nicely into a question I might have for you.
Super.
As your work has evolved and you've moved more into asking musicians to be theatrical and choreographed, which is it's almost the new discipline, I guess, is something that kind of stemmed out of that or came after you. How did you feel during your compositional evolution process? Do you feel trepidation when you first started writing in these ways? Did you feel a sense of freedom? Do you have any advice for composers who are thinking of moving in directions that go beyond just notes on the page, or the way you invented your own instruments or kind of moved away from Western classical instruments in some pieces? I'm really curious how you felt along the evolution of your style.
Great, thank you. Trepidation is not a feeling I had except in inverse, which is I feel great trepidation, really terror, at the idea of being trapped in composing in one way or conceiving of music as only one thing. So the panacea for this, the cure, is to allow this kind of unfettered obsessive curiosity to go in different ways. And one of those ways has been more with this composed theater, which, is really very common now. Let's be clear. I didn't invent this. There's all sorts of things. I think of Coggle and any number of things beforehand, which are sort of antecedents for me in some ways, whether I'm deriving inspiration from them directly or I don't know about them and learn about them later. And then I'll claim, as the Oulipo artist did, that they were anticipatory plagiarists of me. I love this concept of anticipatory plagiarism that the Oulipo poets had. So for me, pieces of music happen because I get curious about something. They almost always begin with a question: what if ellipses? What if we, I don't know. And then there's just some weird, interesting thing that captivates me. And if the idea is captivating enough and my curiosity is aroused sufficiently, I mean, I have like one or several of these ideas each day, and they go down on a little note card and they get in a pile. And then like Loadbang wants a piece, and I'm thinking about it, and then we spent years to develop an actual time where we decided to, as it were, pull the trigger on this piece. And then I'm like, this idea is interesting enough to me with Loadbang. Oh my God, now I need to write this piece. And so then I'm like shot out of a cannon, and I'm very excited, and I explore these different things. And the thing is, and I guess I would tell young composers this as well, is not to understand boundaries, but not respect them as boundaries that can be crossed with awareness. So that's one thing. Second thing is you need skills in other areas, and I don't necessarily have those. It's like I built sound sculptures. I'm not a carpenter. I just kind of got coaxed into some of these things, and I'm clumsily flailing along and figuring it out, and etc. With all the different kinds of things that I do, I just developed some new skills in orbiting media or areas of thought. And so have a healthy disrespect of the boundaries. And in fact, I would invert that and say, anytime scrutinize the boundaries, I would say scrutinize the habits, the mental habits. And here, you can have good habits, but here I mean habit in the pejorative. Scrutinize the artistic habits that you have and inclinations, and immediately distrust them, and then like necessitate that you earn them back. It's almost like you should say, like, every day, wait, why am I playing the trombone?
You need an artistic Rumspringa.
That's it. That's the word that's exactly what I was thinking of. So it's like, you need to like rethink, like, why am I doing this thing? And I've inherited all these traditions, and those traditions are probably good. We don't want to necessarily throw them out, but we want to like really understand, are they actually better? And is there some alternative? And then of course, more likely there's going to be some sort of fusion, and then it might invent some ancillary orbiting way of doing something. And then we get like an extended technique, or in my case, like a concerto for florist and ensemble, where it's like, why not have the world of floristry be like the partner as the concerto soloist with the traditional musical form? And then the other thing that I would say to other composers is, where was I going with this? I had another thing. I don't know. I just think it's really kind of a just do it, I think. And I wouldn't, I had another salient point, but I've lost it. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me 1 minute after this conversation ends. Good.
Well, let me ask you something else then. We were chatting just before we went live about a class that you had just taken up teaching that is super relevant to this situation and built out of this situation. I wanted to chat with you about that for a second.
Yeah, so I was on sabbatical all of last year, and then in the spring quarter at Stanford University, I kind of got recalled to active teaching, and I invented a class 4 days before the spring term started that I was really excited about. It felt like the right thing to do. It's called Creative Agency in the Pandemic World, and it's a class that is about trying to make art under quarantine conditions. And it's a class that is not about making simulacra, which is to say kind of mediocre versions of other things that we could do better when there's not a pandemic, many things that we would like to do. And believe me, I get it. and I feel bad for people who can't do their thing. The thing that like maybe they've constructed their professional egos on the basis of the thing that maybe they need to monetize in order to pay the rent. That's all bad, but this class doesn't address that. This class is not trying to make the art you made before just from your living room. It's about asking the question, saying what if the suboptimal conditions we're in right now were actually super optimal? What if this is the perfect time, and what are the affordances given at this moment might provoke us to make something, and again, I call it, for lack of a better word, quarantine art, which is like so vital and so great and so valuable and so worthwhile that hopefully it will actually become a post-pandemic medium. John Cage, Bacchanal, late 30s, Cornish Institute, doesn't have space for the large percussion ensemble that he wants to write for this dance that will happen in this theater, only has space for a little piano, a grand piano in this little orchestra pit, and he prepares it. And it's more or less, the prepared piano is born out of that. And it turns out, that was like the consequence of this constraint, this necessity. He didn't have space, but he made all these things. And then guess what happens after he has plenty of space? He's still writing prepared piano, because that came out of that moment, which is analogous to the quarantine art moment. And it was so valuable that now we're so glad he did this, and we all can write prepared piano music. So I've noticed that in the past, artists have adopted constraints. Anytime you write haiku or a sonnet or whatever, sonata allegro form, 12-bar blues, you are adopting certain constraints.
Right, or Oulipo, to bring them back up.
Absolutely. Oulipo, write a lipogram or a 50,000 character palindrome, or 5,000 in the case of Perec. So you have these constraints that are adopted by choice, but then you have a history of constraints, and I call these necessitated constraints, and I divide them into three categories. Isolation, which is most comparable to the situation we're in, the very distributed circumstances we're in now. This includes like the whole field of prison literature. This includes the Theresienstadt composers who composed during the Holocaust and managed to compose even while in concentration camps and so forth. Second category I call disability. It's super cool that Ravel wrote the concerto for the left hand in D major for Paul Wittgenstein, the brother of Ludwig Wittgenstein. He lost his arm in World War I. And it's like he could have said, I don't have two hands, so I just give up. That's it. Screw it. Instead, we have this great piece that uses only one hand. You can turn this around and you can say, three hands would be better than two hands on the piano. I know this. This is true. It would be better. And so we could have said, oh, but we don't have three hands. Woe is me. I'm never going to invent the piano. In fact, screw it. Let's not have music because I don't have three hands. No, instead we do the best. We muddle along with two, some of us with one. And then the other area is technical limitation. I think the Cage might be one example of that. And so the idea is we can steel ourselves and hearten ourselves that people have had constraints imposed on them in the past, and they've managed to still make great work. And so I've asked, so the students who are like, can make an installation in their closet and can notice a crack in the wall that they never would have noticed before, and they can fixate on that, and they can think about what that's going to mean in video terms. Whatever it is, whatever the boundary, however you circumscribe the now seemingly limited but still infinite affordances that there are, you can really lean into them and figure out how to make something that is absolutely appropriate to this time. So that's my glasses half full response to this horrible pathogen.
I love that idea of like a discrete infinity, that we have a limited set that feels different, but it's still infinite.
That's right.
It feels like a perfect, I mean, we're almost exactly at 9, so we're stopping regardless, but it feels like an absolute perfect time to play off Mark Applebaum, or allow him to play himself off the stage. Mark, thanks so much for doing this. This is super fun.
Great.
As always, we could hang for hours, but here we are. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, of course. Thanks, everybody on Facebook for checking it out. This will live on YouTube after we're done if you want to check anything out, or listen again to some of the really fantastic things that Mark had to say. We will see you in a few weeks with Paula Matheson. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.